Get my grandkids and they're like, oh, this is where we did that, and this is where I used to go.
The Beatles didn't just end, they collapsed. And for more than 50 years, the question of who lit the fuse has divided fans, biographers, and music historians alike. Paul McCartney spent decades living under the weight of that accusation. But now he's confirmed what he says actually happened behind closed doors. And it's not the story most people grew up believing. The truth involves a private conversation that changed everything. A decision made before the public knew anything was wrong, and a man who never wanted it to end in the first place. The boy who changed music. On June 18, 1942, James Paul McCartney was born in Liverpool to James and Mary McCartney. It was a modest working-class home, but it was filled with warmth, encouragement, and, above all, music. Looking back years later, Paul spoke fondly of his parents and the people around him, describing them as the kind of honest, dependable people every community needs. The salt of the earth. Music was always part of daily life in the McCartney household, thanks largely to Paul's father. Jim McCartney played both the trumpet and the piano, and he made sure his sons grew up surrounded by melodies. It didn't take long for Paul to show that he had a remarkable ear for music. He taught himself to play the piano simply by listening, and joined his local choir, discovering that music came naturally to him. When Paul turned 14, his father gave him a shiny nickel-plated trumpet. It was a thoughtful gift, and for a while, it seemed like the perfect instrument. But then rock and roll swept across Britain, changing everything. Paul wanted to sing while he played, and a trumpet couldn't do that. So he made a decision that would quietly shape the rest of his life. He traded the trumpet for a $15 Framus Zenith acoustic guitar. The guitar, however, came with an unexpected challenge. Paul was left-handed, yet the instrument had been built for a right-handed player. Learning to play suddenly became far more difficult than he had imagined. Then, inspiration arrived from an unlikely place. Paul saw a picture of the left-handed singer Slim Whitman playing his guitar. It gave him a simple but brilliant idea. He reversed the strings on his own instrument, turning it into a guitar that finally felt natural in his hands. From that moment on, the frustration disappeared, and his musical journey truly began. That Framus Zenith became far more than just a guitar. It was where Paul wrote his first song, I Lost My Little Girl. Around the same time, he also experimented on the family piano, creating an early version of what would eventually become the Beatles' classic, When I'm 64. The talent was already there. All he needed now were people who shared the same passion. In 1954, when Paul was just 12 years old, a routine bus journey introduced him to another young music enthusiast named George Harrison. Neither of them could have known it at the time, but the friendship they formed would one day help shape one of the greatest bands in history. For now, they were simply two Liverpool boys, bonded by a love of music. Not long afterward came the meeting that changed everything. At 15, Paul attended a church fete at St. Peter's Church, where a local skiffle group called the Quarrymen was performing. The band's leader was another Liverpool teenager named John Lennon. Their music blended skiffle with the energy of early rock and roll, and Paul was immediately drawn to it. Before long, he was invited to join the group as its rhythm guitarist. It seemed like a small decision at the time, but it became one of the most important moments in modern music history. The creative partnership between Paul McCartney and John Lennon would eventually redefine popular music for generations. Even John Lennon later looked back on that meeting as the moment everything truly began. St. Peter's Church would remain an important place in Beatles history. Years later, A gravestone in its churchyard would inspire the name of one of the band's most beloved songs, Eleanor Rigby. It was remarkable to think that one ordinary church gathering had quietly set the stage for something extraordinary. But Paul's connection with John went much deeper than music. Only a year before meeting John, Paul had experienced a heartbreaking loss. His mother, Mary, had died after suffering an embolism following breast cancer surgery. She was only 47 years old. Mary had worked as a nurse at Liverpool's Walton Hospital and was remembered as a deeply caring mother who loved looking after her family. Despite working alongside doctors every day, she delayed telling anyone when she first noticed pain and discovered a lump in her breast. By the time she sought treatment, she required a mastectomy. The operation appeared successful, but complications followed, and on October 31, 1956, she passed away from an embolism. The loss devastated the McCartney family. Jim McCartney struggled immensely after losing his wife and was reportedly overwhelmed with grief. With the support of relatives, however, he found the strength to focus on raising Paul and his younger brother, Michael. The family carried on, but life was never quite the same. For Paul, music became more than a hobby. It became a refuge. According to Barry Miles's biography, many years from now, Paul threw himself into songwriting after his mother's death. He spent countless hours teaching himself new chords, experimenting with melodies, and writing songs on his acoustic guitar. His first composition, I Lost My Little Girl, was written during this difficult period. Paul later reflected that he never consciously intended the song to be about his mother, although he admitted others would naturally see the connection. Around the same time, his friendship with John Lennon continued to grow stronger. They spent endless hours together writing songs, sharing ideas, and even singing harmonies in each other's homes. Paul often stayed for dinner with John's family, and before long, the two teenagers felt less like friends and more like brothers. Then, tragedy struck again. John's mother, Julia, had always been kind to Paul, perhaps because she understood the pain he was carrying after losing Mary. But just a year after Paul and John met, Julia was struck by a car and killed. In an instant, the two young musicians found themselves sharing the same heartbreak. Both had lost their mothers while still teenagers. It was a bond neither of them would ever have wanted, but it became one of the deepest connections between them. That shared grief quietly found its way into their songwriting. Behind the laughter, ambition, and growing musical success were two young men trying to make sense of profound loss. Together, they discovered that music could express feelings they struggled to put into words. And in doing so, they didn't just find comfort. They found the partnership that would change the history of music forever. The mistake that changed everything. When Paul McCartney first joined the group that would eventually become the Beatles, he was not brought in as a bassist. At the time, the band was still known as the Quarrymen, and Paul's role was very different. He was considered the strongest guitarist in the group, even more technically skilled than John Lennon. So he was asked to play lead guitar as the band slowly moved away from skiffle and embraced the growing sound of rock and roll. On October 18, 1957, Paul made his live debut with the Quarrymen at New Clubmoor Hall in Norris Green, Liverpool. It was the first public performance of a journey that would eventually change music forever. But that unforgettable night did not unfold the way anyone might expect. For someone who would later become one of history's greatest musicians, Paul's first performance was anything but flawless. During rehearsals, he had confidently played the lead guitar solo for Guitar Boogie, originally recorded by Arthur Smith. The band was impressed enough to let him perform it live. But once he stepped onto the stage and all eyes turned toward him, the pressure became overwhelming. As the moment for his solo arrived, his confidence disappeared. His fingers seemed to freeze, and the notes simply would not come. It wasn't a lack of ability that held him back. It was pure stage fright. At just 15 years old, the weight of performing in front of an audience proved too much, and the solo fell apart. That difficult performance quietly changed the band's future. It became increasingly clear they needed someone who could handle lead guitar with complete confidence. Before long, George Harrison stepped into that role, bringing the style and consistency the group needed. Ironically, what felt like a painful setback for Paul turned out to be a blessing in disguise. He would eventually move to bass guitar, an instrument that suited his musical instincts perfectly and helped define the unmistakable Beatles sound. Even the club's promoter, Charlie McBain, seemed unconvinced by what he had seen that evening. He reportedly scribbled the words "good and bad" on the band's visiting card, with the less impressive moments almost certainly including the nervous new guitarist. It was hardly the glowing review anyone hoped for, but history would soon prove just how wrong first impressions could be. While music consumed most of Paul's life, it was not his only focus. In 1959, he met his first serious girlfriend, Dorothy Rohn, at Liverpool's Casbah Coffee Club. Their relationship became an important chapter in his teenage years, but it was far from perfect. According to Beatles biographer Bob Spitz, Paul often tried to shape Dorothy into the image of what he believed the ideal girlfriend should be. He took an unusually active role in choosing her clothes, her makeup, and even her hairstyle. Like both Paul and John Lennon, he admired French actress Brigitte Bardot, and he even paid for Dorothy to have her hair styled to resemble Bardot's famous look. His controlling behavior extended beyond appearance. He discouraged her from smoking and disliked her spending time with friends, while never expecting himself to follow those same rules. It was an immature side of the young Paul that reflected both his youth and his desire to control the world around him. As Paul's personal life grew more complicated, the band itself was beginning to evolve. By 1960, they had experimented with several different names, including Johnny and the Moondogs, the Silver Beatles, and Beatles. But just before leaving for a residency in Hamburg, Germany, they settled on the name that would soon become legendary. They were now simply the Beatles. None of them realized that the trip to Hamburg would become one of the most important turning points of their lives. Hamburg was unlike anything they had experienced in Liverpool. The city was vibrant, chaotic, and full of temptation. The Beatles were expected to perform for hours every night, sometimes playing marathon sets that stretched into the early morning. Paul continued writing letters to Dorothy during his time away, but he later admitted that he also had relationships with other women while living in Hamburg. It was a city that exposed the young musicians to experiences far beyond anything they had known back home. The demanding performance schedule also introduced the band to stimulants. Like many musicians working the Hamburg club scene, they began using Preludin to stay awake through exhausting all-night performances. It marked the beginning of Paul's complicated relationship with drugs, one that would continue in different forms over the years. Hamburg also produced one of the strangest stories in Beatles history. By late 1960, tensions between the band and local club owners had reached breaking point. George Harrison had already been deported after authorities discovered he was only 17, making him too young to legally perform under local regulations. As Paul McCartney and drummer Pete Best prepared to leave their accommodation, they found themselves packing in a dark room with almost no light. Looking for a quick solution, they attached a condom to the wall, set it on fire, and used it as a makeshift torch. It was a reckless decision that immediately backfired. The owner of the club, already angry after discovering the band had accepted work from a rival venue, saw the burn marks left behind and reported Paul to the police for arson. Although the building itself was constructed from non-flammable stone and suffered no serious damage, the authorities took the complaint seriously. Paul spent the night in a German jail. The following morning, he and Pete Best were officially deported and sent back to England alongside George Harrison. For a short time, only John Lennon and bassist Stuart Sutcliffe remained in Hamburg. John returned to Liverpool about 10 days later, while Stuart chose to stay behind after falling in love with German photographer Astrid Kirchherr and enrolling at the Hamburg College of Art. Sadly, Stuart's story ended in tragedy. Just 2 years later, he died in Hamburg from a brain hemorrhage at only 21 years old. The Hamburg years were difficult, chaotic, and sometimes reckless, but they transformed the Beatles into a far stronger band. Long nights on stage sharpened their performances, while the hardships they endured together strengthened their bond. Yet for Paul, the greatest challenge still awaited him back in Liverpool. Soon after returning home, Dorothy revealed that she was pregnant. The news came as a complete surprise. Paul responded by asking her to marry him, and the couple even began making plans for their wedding. For a brief moment, it seemed as though his future would follow a very different path, one centered on family life rather than global fame. But fate had other plans. Dorothy suffered a miscarriage before the wedding could take place. The loss devastated them both, and only weeks later, Paul ended their engagement. The relationship came to an end, leaving him free to devote himself completely to music, just as the Beatles were preparing for their breakthrough. Within a remarkably short time, everything began to change. By 1962, Ringo Starr had joined the group, completing the classic Beatles lineup. That same year, they released Love Me Do, their first hit single. It was only the beginning. By 1963, the songwriting partnership of Lennon and McCartney had become one of the most remarkable creative forces in popular music. Songs like I Saw Her Standing There and Can't Buy Me Love showcased a level of songwriting that set them apart from almost every other band of the era. Before long, Beatlemania swept across Britain before crossing the Atlantic, turning 4 young musicians from Liverpool into international superstars. From the outside, that level of fame looked exhausting. Endless tours, screaming crowds, relentless media attention, and almost no privacy became part of everyday life. But Paul saw it differently. Years later, he reflected that the chaos never felt like a burden. It was the dream he had been chasing since childhood. Standing at the center of enormous crowds, surrounded by cheering fans and police struggling to control the excitement, he felt as though he was living inside the world's greatest movie. Even so, fame brought its own frustrations. The media quickly assigned each Beatle a public identity. John became the witty Beatle. George was the quiet Beatle. Ringo was the funny Beatle. Paul, meanwhile, was labeled the cute Beatle. It was a description he never liked. Over the years, he admitted he had no problem being remembered simply as one of the Beatles. That title represented everything he had worked for. But being reduced to the cute one always bothered him. He never believed it reflected who he really was, and as the years passed, he grew increasingly frustrated that the nickname refused to disappear. Still, those labels were a small price to pay compared to what lay ahead. The Beatles had already achieved more than most musicians could ever dream of. But the biggest chapter of their story was only just beginning. Paul's greatest love fell apart. By the early 1960s, the Beatles had become a cultural phenomenon. Everywhere they went, crowds gathered in overwhelming numbers. Fans screamed, cried, fainted, and chased after them wherever they appeared. The excitement became so intense that it earned its own name, Beatlemania. Among the four young musicians, Paul McCartney quickly emerged as the group's biggest teenage heartthrob. The press regularly labeled him the cute Beatle, and millions of young women dreamed of meeting him. Yet despite the attention, Paul's heart was already set on someone else. In the spring of 1963, he met actress Jane Asher under circumstances that seemed almost scripted. Before a Beatles performance at London's Royal Albert Hall, a photographer arranged for the band to pose with the young actress, who had been assigned by Radio Times to cover the concert. Jane was immediately charmed by the group's energy and personality. She was not the only one impressed. All four Beatles admired the striking, red-haired actress, but it was Paul who eventually walked her home after the event. Along the way, he nervously asked if she would like to see him again. She said yes. It did not take long for photographers to spot the couple together, and soon their relationship became front-page news. They quickly became one of Britain's most talked-about celebrity couples. Behind the flashing cameras and endless headlines, however, Paul's feelings for Jane were genuine. Friends close to the couple could see that he was deeply in love. According to Cynthia Lennon, John's first wife, Paul fell completely for Jane from the very beginning. He was immensely proud to be with her and clearly believed he had found someone truly special. As Beatlemania continued to grow throughout 1963, everyday life became almost impossible. Paul and Jane could no longer enjoy a simple walk through the streets or share a quiet meal without attracting crowds of fans and photographers. Looking for some sense of normality, Paul found a safe haven inside the Asher family home at 57 Wimpole Street in London. Eventually, he moved into the house, living in a small attic room for the next 3 years. That home became far more than just a place to escape the chaos outside. Jane's mother, Margaret Asher, was a respected music teacher who encouraged Paul's curiosity. She introduced him to new instruments, including the recorder, and often shared informal music lessons that expanded his musical knowledge. The house also became one of the most important creative spaces in Beatles history. In the basement music room, Paul and John Lennon wrote several songs side by side, bouncing ideas back and forth as only they could. One of those songs was "I Want to Hold Your Hand," a record that would soon launch Beatlemania across the world. Another unforgettable moment happened upstairs. One morning, Paul woke with a melody still playing in his head after dreaming it during the night. He hurried to the piano to make sure he didn't forget it. That melody would eventually become "Yesterday," one of the most celebrated songs ever written. Living in London also opened an entirely new world for Paul. Instead of spending all his time inside recording studios, he began attending galleries, theater performances, and sophisticated parties. He mixed with artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals, soaking up new ideas and influences. Every conversation and every experience seemed to feed his growing creativity, much of which found its way into the Beatles' increasingly ambitious music. But while Paul's artistic world was expanding, his relationship with Jane was becoming more complicated. Jane was determined to build a successful acting career on her own terms. She refused to be known simply as the girlfriend of a Beatle. Independent, intelligent, and ambitious, she remained committed to her work, even when it meant spending long periods away from Paul. Her determination sometimes frustrated him, but it was also one of the qualities he admired most. Then came 1967. Jane left Britain for a 5-month acting tour, and during her absence, Paul entered another period of personal change. After initially resisting hallucinogenic drugs, he eventually began experimenting with LSD alongside John Lennon during the recording sessions for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Paul later spoke openly about the experience, believing it had broadened his outlook and changed the way he viewed the world. By the time Jane returned home, she found someone who seemed noticeably different. While she had been away building her career, Paul had shared experiences with John that she had not been part of. The emotional distance between them had grown, leaving Jane feeling increasingly disconnected from the man she loved. Unfortunately, that was only part of the problem. Although Paul remained devoted to Jane in many ways, he was also living the life of one of the world's biggest rock stars. Throughout their relationship, he had a number of affairs, believing that because he was unmarried, he was not breaking any formal commitment. Even so, he understood that such relationships had to remain hidden from the press. Among the women linked to Paul was American actress Peggy Lipton, who would later become widely known for her role in the Mod Squad. Reports suggested the two met secretly on several occasions during the mid-1960s while Jane remained in London. Journalist Ivor Davis, who accompanied the Beatles during their first American tour in 1964, later claimed that Peggy had told him Paul even spoke about marrying her. Whether every detail was accurate or not, the stories reflected the growing strain that fame was placing on Paul's relationship with Jane. Despite the difficulties, the couple surprised many people on Christmas Day, 1967, by announcing their engagement. For a brief moment, it appeared they had overcome the challenges facing them. But the fairy tale was nearing its end. Not long afterward, Jane unexpectedly arrived at Paul's home without warning. What she found changed everything. She walked in to discover Paul in bed with American writer Francie Schwartz. Heartbroken, Jane quietly turned around and left. There was little left to save. By the summer of 1968, their 5-year relationship had come to an end. Jane later confirmed the breakup during an appearance on the BBC program D-Time. Although the relationship was over, she made it clear there was no bitterness between them. They still cared deeply for one another, but love alone had not been enough to keep them together. In the years that followed, Jane rarely spoke publicly about their time together. Their relationship had been one of the defining romances of the Beatlemania era, a story filled with love, creativity, ambition, and heartbreak. For Paul McCartney, it marked the end of one important chapter. Another life-changing one was about to begin. The beginning of the end. By the mid-1960s, the Beatles were changing in ways that few people could have predicted. The clean-cut band that had conquered the world with catchy love songs was growing more adventurous with every album. No one embraced that transformation more enthusiastically than Paul McCartney. Paul had become fascinated by avant-garde art, experimental music, and unconventional ideas. He immersed himself in London's creative scene, explored new artistic movements, and even produced a few experimental films of his own. He was constantly searching for fresh ways to push both himself and the band beyond the limits of traditional pop music. One of the clearest examples of that came during the recording of Tomorrow Never Knows. Although the song is often associated with John Lennon's visionary lyrics, much of its groundbreaking sound came from Paul's experiments with tape loops. By manipulating recorded sounds and layering them together, he helped create one of the most innovative recordings of its time. But creative ambition often came with creative conflict. As Paul and John continued developing as songwriters, differences between them became increasingly difficult to ignore. The tension had already begun around the Rubber Soul era, and as the band's fame reached unimaginable heights, the pressure only intensified. Years of relentless touring had left all 4 Beatles physically and emotionally exhausted. Paul later reflected that the constant cycle of performances made them feel as though they were losing their souls. By the end of their 1966 American tour, they reached a decision that would change the course of their careers forever. The Beatles would never perform another live concert. For many bands, that might have marked the beginning of the end. For Paul, it became an opportunity. Freed from the demands of touring, he threw himself into new ideas. He became the driving force behind Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, encouraging the group to imagine themselves as fictional musicians rather than simply the Beatles. He believed they had outgrown their old image and wanted to create music without the expectations that came with being the world's most famous band. The gamble paid off. Sgt. Pepper was praised as a masterpiece and remains one of the most influential albums ever recorded. Yet, in a cruel twist of fate, it also marked the beginning of the band's slow unraveling. Later that same year, tragedy struck. Brian Epstein, the man who had discovered, guided, and protected the Beatles from the beginning, died unexpectedly in August 1967. More than a manager, he had been a stabilizing force and, in many ways, a father figure to the group. With Brian gone, Paul naturally stepped forward to keep the band moving. He organized projects, pushed for new ideas, and tried to hold everyone together. Not everyone welcomed his leadership. John Lennon, in particular, felt that Paul was becoming too controlling, and disagreements that had once been manageable began turning into serious divisions. The bond that had held the group together for years was starting to weaken. As tensions inside the band continued to grow, Paul found comfort somewhere completely unexpected. He had met photographer Linda Eastman several times before they officially began dating. Linda was far more than another photographer covering the music scene. Through determination and talent, she had earned extraordinary access to many of the biggest names in entertainment. Early in her career, she famously managed to become the only photographer at a promotional event for the Rolling Stones, a breakthrough that helped establish her reputation. By 1968, she became the first woman to photograph a cover for Rolling Stone magazine, breaking barriers in a profession largely dominated by men. Their story truly began on a spring evening in May 1967. Brian Epstein had just hosted a dinner celebrating the completion of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Afterward, Paul headed to one of his favorite London hangouts, the Bag O'Nail's nightclub in Soho. That evening, Georgie Fame and the Blue Flames were performing. Among the crowd was Linda Eastman, who was visiting London while working on a photography project titled Rock and Other Four-Letter Words. She had arrived with friends connected to the band The Animals. Before long, she introduced herself to Paul. It was a simple meeting, but one neither of them would ever forget. As the evening came to an end and Linda walked past Paul's table, he quickly struck up a conversation and invited her to continue the night with him and his friends at another club. The invitation worked. During their conversation, Paul mentioned that he owned original paintings by the surrealist René Magritte, an artist Linda greatly admired. Their shared interest in art created an instant connection, and she accepted his invitation to visit his home. They talked late into the night. Even so, the timing was far from ideal. Paul was still engaged to Jane Asher, making a serious relationship with Linda impossible. Yet neither of them forgot that first meeting. After Paul's engagement to Jane finally ended, he found himself thinking about Linda again and again. Out of all the women he had known, she remained the one who stayed in his thoughts. In September 1968, he finally picked up the phone and invited her to London. This time, everything was different. Their relationship developed quickly, built on far more than physical attraction. They shared a love of photography, music, nature, family life, and art. For Paul, Linda brought a sense of calm that had been missing from his increasingly complicated world. Not long afterward, Paul traveled to New York after finishing work on the White Album. There, he spent time not only with Linda, but also with her young daughter, Heather. Away from the chaos of Beatlemania, New York offered something Paul had not experienced in years: freedom. Growing a beard helped him blend into the crowds, allowing him to walk through the city, ride the subway, and explore without constantly being recognized. For someone who had spent years surrounded by screaming fans, the experience felt almost unbelievable. By the end of 1968, Paul no longer had any doubts. Linda was the woman he wanted to spend his life with. While the couple were visiting Portugal, he asked her to marry him. She accepted. On March 12, 1969, Paul McCartney and Linda Eastman were married at Marylebone Register Office in London. Despite rainy weather, hundreds of Beatles fans gathered outside hoping to catch a glimpse of the newlyweds. The ceremony itself was surprisingly modest. Linda was already 4 months pregnant, and Paul's brother Mike was supposed to serve as best man. Unfortunately, his train broke down on the journey to London, causing him to arrive late. When the ceremony finally took place, the official witnesses were Mike McCartney and longtime Beatles assistant Mal Evans. Linda's daughter Heather was also there, already becoming part of Paul's growing family. The wedding almost never happened. The night before, Paul and Linda had argued so intensely that they nearly called the entire ceremony off. Years later, Paul admitted their relationship was never as effortless as many people imagined. From the outside, they appeared to have the perfect marriage, but the reality was far more complicated. Like any couple, they argued, struggled, and worked through difficult moments together. That honesty made the lasting success of their marriage even more remarkable. One detail about the wedding surprised many people. None of the other Beatles attended. It was not because they had been unavailable. Paul simply had not invited them. By early 1969, relationships within the band had deteriorated badly. Years of creative disagreements, business disputes, and personal frustrations had left them drifting apart. The close-knit brotherhood that had once defined the Beatles was rapidly disappearing. As if that were not enough, Paul soon found himself at the center of one of the strangest conspiracy theories in music history. Late in 1969, rumors spread claiming that Paul had secretly died in a car accident years earlier and had been replaced by a look-alike. The bizarre story, later known as the Paul is Dead conspiracy, quickly captured the public imagination. Fans began examining album covers, song lyrics, and interviews, convinced they contained hidden clues pointing to an elaborate cover-up. The speculation became so widespread that Paul eventually decided to address it. He posed with Linda, their newborn daughter Mary, and Heather for the cover of Life magazine, offering the public a simple but unmistakable message that he was alive and well. The family portrait helped bring the rumors to an end. But while fans finally stopped worrying about losing Paul, they were about to lose something even bigger: the Beatles themselves. By 1970, the divisions inside the group had become impossible to repair. Years of creative conflict, business disagreements, and personal frustration had pushed the band beyond its breaking point. On April 10, 1970, Paul publicly announced that he was leaving the Beatles. Paul McCartney confirms why the Beatles actually split in 1970. For decades, one question has followed Paul McCartney everywhere he goes: who was really responsible for breaking up the Beatles? Many people believed Paul was the one who ended the world's biggest band, especially after he publicly announced his departure in 1970. But years later, he offered a very different version of events. During an appearance on the BBC Radio 4 program, This Cultural Life, Paul explained that he did not see himself as the person who caused the breakup. In his view, that decision had already been made by John Lennon. Looking back, Paul described the collapse of the Beatles as one of the most painful periods of his life. He had never wanted the band to end. To him, the Beatles were more than just four musicians making records. They were his family, his career, and the life he had built since he was a teenager. He believed they were still producing excellent music and felt there was no reason they couldn't continue together. According to Paul, the turning point came when John Lennon privately announced that he was leaving the group. From that moment, Paul believed the future of the Beatles had fundamentally changed. He later reflected that if John had chosen to stay, the band might have continued for many more years. Paul also shared his thoughts on why John made that decision. He believed John was entering a completely different chapter of his life, alongside Yoko Ono. In Paul's view, John had always carried a strong desire to break away from expectations and redefine himself. Beginning a new life with Yoko gave him the opportunity to do exactly that, making it increasingly difficult for him to remain committed to the Beatles. After John's departure, Paul, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr were left trying to figure out what would happen next. They found themselves attempting to hold together a band that was already beginning to fall apart. The difficulties did not end there. Following the breakup, Paul faced another painful decision. He took legal action against his own bandmates, a move that shocked fans around the world and reinforced the belief that he had been responsible for the group's collapse. But Paul's motivation, he later explained, had nothing to do with ending the Beatles. Instead, he believed legal action was the only way to protect the band's business affairs from their new manager, Alan Klein. While the other three Beatles supported Klein's management, Paul strongly disagreed with that decision and felt he had no alternative but to challenge it in court. Although the lawsuit created even greater tension at the time, Paul later revealed that his former bandmates eventually understood why he had taken that step. Years afterward, they reportedly thanked him for protecting the group's interests. Even so, he continued to insist on one important point. He had fought over business matters, but he had not been the person who brought the Beatles to an end.